Mark, it's wonderful to meet you, sir. Thank you for taking a minute out today.
Delighted to be here.
So, Mark, let's begin our conversation to get into your work and your vision. I want to begin with COVID and how you survived that pandemic and how many ripples it created that has affected the way that you do work now.
I conduct corporate time studies. I have a small electronic device for those who are watching called a TimeCorder, and I lend that out to employees to track how they spend their time. COVID didn't make a difference. I've always worked out of my house, so that's okay. I send those devices to people and they track their time remotely, so I never visit them. So in my case, it didn't make a difference. We were measuring employees who maybe had worked in an office environment and now were working out of home. So that was a little bit different. The trends weren't massively different for them. They were still doing paperwork. They were still processing orders and so on. It didn't make a whole lot of difference for me. I live in a nice house and, I've got lots of room here where other people were around. So I managed my way through that okay.
So, let's get to the heart and soul of what you do on a daily basis as the kind of the time study consultant. And I'm going to do that by putting you in front of a bunch of grade school kids. It's career day, and one of the curious kids in the back of the room is like, "Hey, what do you do for a living?" What's your answer?
I show organizations how their employees can spend more time on their top priority activities. And I do that by measuring their time. So for you kids, if you want to spend more time doing sports or more time doing, schoolwork, you got to find out what the things are that are taking you away from the things you want to be doing. And I can measure those and show you, let's do less of that and more of this.
So let's put you in that grade school seat years ago. What was your dream? What did you want to be when you grew up?
Well, actually, I was a paper boy and I was delivering newspapers, and somehow I got the idea that I could be really productive delivering newspapers. And I just got these ideas at the time. So maybe I always wanted to be a productivity consultant guy. But, delivering papers, the first thing I did was invest in technology. I bought a wagon. It was easier than carrying those things around.
Yeah.
I had to figure out time and motion. So for instance, on the weekends, and people don't know much about newspapers these days, but anyway, the newspaper came with an insert, a magazine. They were published separately, and the magazine had to go inside the paper. And at the depot, where all of us paper boys gathered to pick up our newspapers, everyone was putting those inserts in the paper. I thought, boy, they're really slow. And I figured out a faster way to do that. That was kind of enjoyable to me to figure out how could I do this quickly. We had to go and collect from our customers every single week. Hello, knock on the door. You owe, this much money, a buck back then. And I thought, yeah, it takes a lot of time. If I divide my route in half, I could do half and collect for 2 weeks, and then the other half and collect for 2 weeks. And so that was another way of being efficient by batching my tasks. And of course, the one everybody probably knows, you see old movies of kids delivering papers and then roll up the paper and throw it from a bicycle or something. So I figured out how to roll up papers, and although that takes some time, so the question is, do you roll up the paper and invest time there so you can save a few steps. So all these different things were ways for me to think about productivity as a newspaper boy.
So what were the foundational seeds that were planted into you to have you think like this? Take me back to your childhood, where you were born and raised, and what were some of these seeds that ended up becoming a part of this manifestation of teaching and helping people manage their time better?
I don't know how that happened. I tend to be fairly creative, so I write poetry, and I was always doing creative thinking stuff and invented the TimeCorder device. As a kid, I'm not sure where all that came from. It's just delivering papers and figuring out how do I get more time for the other stuff and spend less on newspapers. I like the idea of being an entrepreneur and earning money and running my own business. So all those things came together, I guess. Um, Later on, as working for a big company, boy, was I frustrated at how late meetings were getting started. And I'd look around and think, oh, it's, 10 after and we should be meeting and where is everybody? And I just thought, well, what if we sort of measured this time that we're wasting and oh, we could have a device and it'd be like a chess clock, but in reverse. And so I had that kind of aha moment of thinking about measuring time and a device to do that. We all have those aha moments. But how many people pursue them? And so I pursued that one and developed prototypes and turned it into a business and so on. So I guess I just somehow was always thinking about being productive, and that's what led to where I am today.
What was the first job that you had that really kind of groomed you for this, where you felt like, I know you had this feeling of doing it, but what was the first gig, the first job where you were like, this makes sense. This is a life that I can see myself living.
I was in product management at Procter and Gamble, and so we did a lot of marketing, but we did a lot of analytic work as well. You had to understand how your shipments were going into what province and how that compared a year ago and so on. And so I guess that idea of analyzing data and having conclusions that were based on real data, on science in a way, was what intrigued me. You look out there and you see lots of people with lots of ideas about things. And in the time management world, everyone's got ideas about how things should work. But I always thought, well, but what's the science? What's the data behind that? And so I guess the Procter and Gamble experience analyzing all that data and research reports helped give me a grounding to think about making conclusions that were based on fact rather than just guessing at things.
Isn't this a constant in the world of business, though? From the top down, especially at the top, they're always thinking about ways of maximizing time and productivity. Isn't that always just something that's always in the backdrop of R&D for companies? Is that pretty consistent?
It is. If you build a machine that can do things faster, I mean, going back to the printing press or, automation with CNC machines that can, or, printing or whatever it is. So you invest in capital, but we also have people. And what tends to happen, and this is kind of a bit of a conclusion, is that companies don't think the same way about their employees. Well, if somebody wants to work overtime, like a manager who are just paying a salary, well, they'll work overtime because they want to get ahead, because they want to, get strong results. And so the idea of caring about employees' productivity isn't always that front and center because those employees will just work themselves to the bone. Well, there's a cost to that. You get turnover, you get stress, you get burnout, and so on. Yet, it's not as top of mind an issue as people like me would like it to be, to make a good working environment where people are doing their best and not encumbered by uh, administrative impediments and so on. So they end up working 55 hours a week and the company gets free labor. So they just sort of take that free labor and don't always work on streamlining that.
So of all of the companies that exist out there, there's a lot of them that do things really well, and we may not see the back end of it. But from your viewpoint, what company is really good at being productive and delivering a product and having a great image, treating employees well? Is there an example out there that you emulate and that you look up to?
I think some of the Canadian banks that I've worked with, they tend to get top marks in terms of employee satisfaction. And so, what is that? It's a clear vision that the organization has. It's clarity about job roles, about what people are doing. It's promotion from within so that people can see a career path. And it's doing work that's of value. That's probably the most important. Do people think they're doing work of value? Sometimes people approach me and say, oh, people are wasting their time. I don't like using that phrase. I think if employees are dedicated to doing something that makes a difference, they will work hard and they won't waste time. The waste often comes from things that are outside of their control. The company's changing directions, or another department hasn't fulfilled its obligations to getting some aspect of the work done. So it's not that people are procrastinating or goofing off, it's rather other forces. And so I'm trying to measure some of that to say, okay, what are the systemic issues about paperwork or processes that we can measure? And then you can streamline those and delegate them or automate them or whatever.
So, who's been kind of a hero or a role model for you that's inspired the work that you've done?
Good gosh, anyone who's measuring things. I belong to the International Association of Time Use Research. It tends to be a lot of PhDs and sort of government people that gather data about time use, and that tends to be at home. So we look at men and women and how they spend their time differently in doing unpaid work, like caring for children and so on. So some of those people that I hang out with at these annual conferences, they kind of inspire me. What they don't do is they don't tend to spend much time in the workplace. So that's been my focus on looking at employees, knowledge workers in the workplace to complement what the other time use data is saying about how people spend their time kind of at home. Work tends to be one big category for them. Well, I've divided that down into thousands of different activities to measure that in more detail.
So, when you look at the arc of your career, what is it that consistently gets you up every day to be at the top of your game, to do the job well, but to also evolve as a human being yourself? What is that collective energy every day for you?
uh, Knowing that I'm making a difference based on this data. And new the data will come, the time quarters will come back, and it's like, wow, here's all this interesting information here. How can I sort through this? How can I see what patterns and trends there are? It's like a little exploring game when the data comes back. And I know at the other end, the employees really like it. All of our studies are anonymous. I never use employees' names in my reports. So they embrace it as well. And I'm always delighted, like, wow, this person tracked 200 or 300 different activities over the course of a couple of weeks. Wow, that's really neat. And it's sort of delightful to find out that it got taken up well at the other end by the employees. But again, the results are always anonymous. So I get a really good participation rate of about 94%. And that's unheard of for employee surveys. So that's kind of exciting to me to see the data and start finding my way through it.
So, when companies actually implement this data research that you do, it has to send an enormous amount of ripples out that affects every single part of that company.
Well, we tend to work on specific areas, so it might be the sales department or
Sure.
order processing or something. But yes, they're saying we know that we're not quite sure what's going on out there. We want our salespeople to be selling more, and what's getting in their way. And so that's what I'm measuring and showing them. They kind of have some ideas, but they're not really sure. And so that's how I can show them how to be more productive.
The one thing about our current political landscape in America is that the new administration coming in is saying they want all these federal employees to come back to work. And there's been kind of that weird back and forth since the pandemic began. Remote work became kind of the standard. Now we're like 4 years out, and people like this administration is saying people need to come to work, and if they don't, they may not have a job. What's your stand on how the workforce adopted this remote mindset, and should we go back to being in person?
Well, during COVID, lots of consultants and specialists said, "Oh, work is never going to be the same." And I thought, I'm not going to say anything yet. It's still new, and I think it still is new. The good news is that we have this ability to work remotely. And so, if your child is sick, or if you got a doctor's appointment, or if something's gone wrong, or a snowstorm, then you can work remotely, and I think that makes sense. On the other hand, those promoting for back to work are doing so for because different reasons. One is collaboration. Meetings and collaboration work better in person than they do over a Zoom meeting. Also, Managers tell me that doing performance reviews and feedback and so on, that works better. If you've got a performance problem, it's better to do that in person. There's also a kind of synchronicity. If we're all in a bullpen together and we're making calls or handling things, we can kind of help each other out. So that's a reason to work together as well. So there are some good reasons for it. The cost is the commuting time, and are people better working at home? One expert said, if you're doing all of your work at home and never going to the office, maybe your job's going to be at risk someday. So there is that. So I don't have a particular point of view. What we found is that work patterns tend to be the same, whether you're in an office or at home. So I'll let others decide how many days they ought to work in the office. I think there should be some number of days for the reasons that I mentioned, but I think it's also terrific that people have that ability to be flexible when they and work remotely when they need to.
So let's say you have a dream tonight. You run into like an 18-year-old version of yourself, and you could give that young version of you a piece of advice based on this life you've lived, this career you've had, the wisdom you've accumulated. What advice would you impart on that young version of you?
At that time, I was a little bit cocky and know-it-all, and that might have hurt me a little bit. So I think the wisdom advice I'd say is, be really clear about what's important to you, about your values. In my case, I'm a creative guy. I tend to see the world a bit differently, and that can rub people a little bit wrong. I would say your relationships are going to be the key to your success, and be really careful about how you manage those. You might have this thing that you do and you're really good at. You can't do that in isolation. So work well with people. And that's something I've worked on over the years and certainly got better at.
So, Mark, of everything that you've done and accomplished in your career and in your life, what are you ultimately the proudest of?
I'm proudest that I created this business out of nothing. I invented a physical product and created a business around it, and using that to make a difference to the world and showing organizations how their employees can become more productive.
So, at the end of the day, everyone out there has a perception of you, family, friends, clients, everyone that knows you, but you are in control. You run the show. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
I'm a creative individual. I see the world a little bit differently. I do things a little differently. I couldn't do a job like, I don't know, selling real estate or something like that. I need to have a unique mark on what I do. And I'm proud of some of the findings from the most recent research showing that employees spend 20% of their time on their top priorities. That's a finding that's not out there in the time management literature, and I've been able to demonstrate that and show how important it is. And one of my recent conclusions that women are actually more productive than men. Women spend 22% of their time on their top priority activities. Men are only at 18%, and that's quite profound. So I'm proud of some of those kinds of conclusions and findings that I've made, and want to let the world know about that.
Yeah, I'm not surprised by that at all. So, what's the best thing about living in Toronto?
I think it's a walkable city. I ride my bike all over the place. We've got lots of little neighborhoods that work really well, where you can go and shop. We can go days without using our car. So I like that about it. And I like the idea that it's got great transit and some terrific parks. So it's a wonderful modern city. It's got some challenges, traffic people don't like, but I think it's a wonderful, livable city.
Yeah, for sure. So, Mark, if anyone wants to reach out, learn more, any of the good business, get involved, how can they do it?
My website is getmoredone.com. I'm Mark at getmoredone.com. Go to that website and there's a contact sheet. You can reach me through that.
Excellent. Mark, thank you, sir. Thank you for your story. Thank you for your time. Have a wonderful holiday season.
You're welcome.